Hey guys, tonight we begin with the sweat-soaked, blood-stained reality of Rome's ultimate war machine, the Roman Legion. Not the Hollywood version with gleaming armour and heroic speeches, but the brutal, unforgiving meat grinder that turned ordinary men into instruments of conquest and left most of them broken, bitter, or buried in unmarked graves across 3 continents. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing in line with dozens of other desperate men, most of whom smell like they've been wrestling pigs in a swamp. The year is 150 CE and you've just made the worst decision of your life. You've decided to join the Roman Legion. Maybe you're running from debt, maybe you're fleeing a crime, or maybe you're just naive enough to believe the recruiter's promises about glory, honour and enough coin to buy your own farm. Whatever brought you here, one thing's certain. You have absolutely no idea what you've signed up for. The recruitment process isn't some noble ceremony with trumpets and speeches about serving the empire. It's a cattle auction where you're the livestock. A grizzled recruiter, probably a veteran with more scars than teeth, looks you up and down like you're a horse he might consider buying. He checks your teeth, not because he cares about your dental hygiene, but because rotting teeth mean you can't chew the rock-hard bread that'll be your primary food source for the next quarter century. He examines your build, looking for shoulders broad enough to carry 60 pounds of gear across endless miles of hostile terrain. Flat feet? Rejected. Obvious cowardice? Outside. Any sign that you might collapse after your first forced march? Next. But here's where it gets interesting. The Roman military machine didn't just want warm bodies. They wanted men who could be moulded, broken down, and rebuilt into something entirely different. Something that would march into hell if ordered and ask only how fast they should walk. The oath you're about to take isn't to Rome, the Senate, or even the Emperor. It's to your commanding officer, who will own your soul for the next 25 years. And this oath, sworn before the gods and witnessed by your fellow recruits, isn't just words. Breaking it means death. Not exile, not prison, death. Usually at the hands of your own comrades. Let's pause here for a moment and really absorb what you've just committed to. 25 years. That's not a tour of duty. That's your entire adult life. You'll enter as a teenager and emerge, if you're lucky enough to emerge at all, as a middle-aged man with joints that creak like old leather and nightmares that wake you in cold sweats. The Empire doesn't care about your hopes, dreams, or the girl you left behind in your village. You're now property of Rome, a walking weapon with legs. The moment you sign that paperwork, assuming you can even write your name, your old identity dies. You're no longer Marcus the farmer's son, or Gaius the blacksmith's apprentice. You're Miles, which literally means soldier. Your individuality is stripped away faster than your civilian clothes. Everyone gets the same brutal haircut, the same rough-spun tunic, the same hard-soled sandals that'll give you blisters for the first month and calluses for life. You're issued a number, assigned to a century of 80 men, and told that these strangers are now closer to you than your own family. Because unlike your family, these men will determine whether you live or die in the battles to come. But the real shock comes when you meet your centurion. This man, usually in his 30s or 40s, which makes him ancient by legionary standards, is about to become the most important and most terrifying person in your life. He's survived long enough to earn command, which means he's either incredibly skilled, incredibly lucky, or incredibly ruthless. Probably all 3. His armour is polished to a mirror shine, his vine staff, the vitis, has left its mark on more skulls than you can count, and his eyes hold the kind of cold calculation that comes from watching boys become soldiers and soldiers become corpses. Your centurion doesn't just train you, he owns you. Every aspect of your existence, from when you wake to when you sleep, from what you eat to how you think, falls under his absolute authority. Question his orders, and you'll be digging latrines until your hands bleed. Disobey him, and you'll face the lash. Show cowardice, and he might just decide that the unit is better off without you. The vitis isn't just a symbol of rank, it's a tool of correction, applied liberally to anyone who needs reminding of their place in the legion's hierarchy. This is where the true horror of Roman military life begins to reveal itself. The discipline isn't just strict, it's designed to break your spirit and rebuild it in Rome's image. If one man in your unit screws up, everyone pays. Drop your shield during drill, and your entire sentry runs laps in full gear. Fall asleep on watch duty, and your tent mates might just beat you themselves before the centurion gets his turn. The Romans understood something that modern militaries still grapple with. Individual excellence means nothing if the unit fails. So they made sure that peer pressure and group punishment created an environment where letting down your comrades wasn't just discouraged, it was unthinkable. And speaking of your comrades, let's talk about your new living situation. You'll be sharing a tent with 7 other men, none of whom you chose, all of whom come from different backgrounds, and probably speak different dialects. Privacy is now a concept from your past life. You'll eat together, sleep together, march together, and quite possibly die together. The man snoring next to you might be a former criminal trying to earn citizenship. The guy who keeps talking about his girlfriend back home could be a farmer's son looking for adventure. The quiet one sharpening his dagger might be a freedman trying to prove his worth to Rome. These men will become closer to you than brothers, and you'll hate every single one of them at some point during your service. When Marcus keeps you awake with his night terrors from the battle at the Rhine. When Lucius steals your bread ration because he lost his in a dice game. When Quintus gets drunk and starts a fight that lands your entire unit on punishment detail. But you'll also learn to depend on them in ways you never thought possible. Because when the barbarians come screaming out of the forest with axes raised and murder in their eyes, these irritating, smelly, argumentative tent mates are the only thing standing between you and a very unpleasant death. The equipment you're issued tells its own story about Roman priorities. Your gladius, that short-stabbing sword, isn't designed for dramatic duels or fancy swordplay. It's an efficient killing tool, meant to punch through ribs and into vital organs with minimal fuss. Your scutum, the massive rectangular shield, isn't just for defence. It's a weapon in its own right, designed to bash enemies off balance before the gladius finishes them. Your pilum, the throwing spear, has a clever bit of engineering that makes it bend on impact so enemies can't throw it back at you. Every piece of gear you carry has been refined through centuries of warfare, paid for with the blood of legionaries who learned what worked and what got you killed. But here's what the recruiting officer didn't mention. You don't just carry weapons, you carry everything. Your cooking pot, your digging tools, your spare sandals, your cloak, your personal kit, and portions of the unit's shared equipment. The Romans called this the mule load, and you are the mule. 60 pounds of gear on your back, marching 20 miles a day in formation, maintaining perfect discipline while your feet develop blisters the size of grapes, and your shoulders scream for mercy. The daily routine is designed to crush any remaining traces of civilian softness. Before dawn, you're roused by a horn that sounds like death itself. No snooze button, no gradual awakening, just an immediate transition from unconsciousness to standing at attention, while a centurion who clearly didn't get enough sleep takes out his frustrations on anyone within reach of his vine staff. Breakfast, if you can call it that, consists of hard bread and sour wine mixed with water. The bread could probably stop an arrow, and the wine tastes like it was made from grapes that died of disappointment. Then comes the real fun. Training. Hours upon hours of repetitive drills designed to make your reactions automatic. You'll stab straw dummies until your arm feels like it's going to fall off. You'll practice shield formations until you can move as one unit with 80 other men without thinking about it. You'll march in perfect step, turn in unison, and advance in formation until the movements become as natural as breathing. Because in battle, when terror threatens to freeze your mind and chaos reigns around you, these drilled movements might be the only thing that keeps you alive. The Romans understood that warfare isn't about individual heroics. It's about discipline, coordination, and the ability to function as part of a larger machine, even when everything around you is falling apart. So they drilled that understanding into you with relentless repetition, harsh punishment for errors, and the constant reminder that your life depends on the man next to you doing his job correctly. But even this intensive training is just preparation for the real test. because sooner or later, probably sooner, you're going to be marched to some god's-forsaken corner of the empire where the locals have decided they don't particularly enjoy being conquered. And that's when all this training, all this discipline, all this systematic destruction of your former self will be put to the ultimate test. The Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine don't care about Roman discipline. The Pictish warriors in the northern reaches of Britain aren't impressed by your formation drills. And the Parthian horse archers on the eastern frontier have their own ideas about how battles should be fought. Ideas that don't involve standing still in neat lines while they fill you full of arrows. This is where the true brutality of legionary life reveals itself. You're not just a soldier, you're a colonist, an occupying force in lands where every tree might hide an enemy, and every friendly face might belong to someone planning to cut your throat while you sleep. The people you're fighting aren't evil. They're defending their homes, their families, their way of life against an invading army that happens to include you. But the Legion doesn't care about moral complexity. It cares about results, and results are measured in territory conquered, enemies killed, and rebellion crushed. Your first taste of real combat comes faster than you'd like, and hits harder than you ever imagined. All those months of stabbing straw dummies and practicing formations suddenly feel pathetically inadequate when you're staring across a muddy field at a horde of screaming barbarians who look like they gargle with blood and floss with human sinew. The enemy doesn't follow Roman rules. They don't line up politely and wait for the signal to begin. They charge out of forests like rabid animals painted for war, wielding axes that could split a tree trunk and making sounds that would give nightmares to the dead. Your bowels, despite all that disciplined training, have apparently decided this would be an excellent time to remind you that you're still just a terrified farm boy wearing borrowed armour. But here's where all that brutal conditioning pays off, or kills you. Your centurion's voice cuts through the chaos like a blade through butter, barking orders that your body obeys before your mind even processes them. Shield up, gladius ready, step forward, maintain formation. The man next to you is probably pissing himself too, but he's also moving in perfect synchronization because the alternative is death for everyone. The testudo formation, that famous turtle shell of shields, isn't some tactical masterpiece you admire from a distance. It's a claustrophobic nightmare where you're pressed against sweaty, terrified men while arrows thunk into the shield wall inches from your face. You can hear the enemy screaming challenges in languages you don't understand, hurling insults that probably question your mother's virtue and your father's species. The air inside the formation tastes like fierce sweat and iron, and you realise that the iron taste is blood from someone's split lip. When the formations finally clash, it's nothing like the clean battles described in heroic poems. It's a grinding, chaotic meat grinder where the goal isn't glory but simply not dying in the next few seconds. Your gladius finds soft spots between ribs, and you feel warm blood splash across your hands. The enemy's breath is hot on your face as you wrestle for position, and you discover that killing someone requires more effort than you expected. Bodies don't just fall over dramatically. They fight back, they grab at your gear, they try to take you with them into whatever afterlife awaits. The sounds are what stay with you afterward. Not just the clash of metal on metal, but the wet sounds, the gurgling, the sudden silence when someone stops screaming. Your ears ring from the noise, your arms ache from holding your shield, and your legs shake from the adrenaline that's been coursing through your system for what feels like hours, but was probably only minutes. Victory, when it comes, doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like exhaustion mixed with relief, and a growing awareness that you're covered in blood, some of it yours, most of it belonging to people who were alive when the sun came up this morning. The battlefield afterward looks like a slaughterhouse exploded. Bodies lie twisted in positions that shouldn't be possible. Weapons are scattered like deadly toys, and the ground is churned into a muddy paste of earth and gore. But you're alive, which puts you ahead of about 30% of your century. The men who aren't getting back up include Marcus, who always talked about his farm back in Gaul, and young Quintus, who never got to see his 20th birthday. Their deaths aren't heroic or meaningful. They're just random, brutal facts in Rome's ongoing conquest of the world. The aftermath is almost worse than the battle itself. You help strip the dead of anything useful, enemy and Roman alike. Weapons, armour, personal effects, anything that might be valuable or necessary for the next fight. You try not to look at faces. Try not to think about the fact that the barbarian whose sword you're now carrying probably had a family waiting for him somewhere beyond the frontier. Medical treatment in the Legion is a blend of practical knowledge and desperate improvisation. If you're wounded, you might get sewn up by a medicus who learned his trade by doing it, not by studying scrolls in some comfortable classroom. Infection is common, amputation is sometimes necessary, and death from seemingly minor wounds happens more often than anyone likes to admit. Pain relief consists of strong wine and biting down on a leather strap, while someone digs arrow points out of your flesh. The psychological toll is something no one talks about but everyone carries. You learn to function with the constant knowledge that today might be your last day breathing. You develop a gallows humour that would shock civilians, joking about death and dismemberment, because the alternative is going mad from the stress. Sleep becomes elusive, interrupted by nightmares where you relive battles or imagine new and creative ways to die. Between campaigns, life settles into a routine that's only marginally less miserable than active warfare. You build roads, construct fortifications, dig latrines, repair equipment, and train constantly. The Empire doesn't run itself, and every piece of infrastructure requires muscle and sweat from legionaries who signed up for glory, but spend most of their time with shovels in their hands. Building Roman roads sounds romantic until you're actually doing it. It means moving tons of stone by hand, digging foundations in all weather, and maintaining engineering standards that would impress modern construction crews. Your back aches constantly. Your hands are permanently stained with dirt and calluses, and you begin to suspect that the engineers who designed these projects never actually had to build them themselves. Camp construction is another daily torment. Every night, without exception, you dig a fortified camp. Trenches, palisades, watchtowers, the works. It doesn't matter if you're stopping for one night or planning to stay for months. The camp gets built to Roman standards, which means perfectly measured, properly constructed and defensible against anything short of a full legion assault. By the time it's finished, you're exhausted, but at least you can sleep knowing that pickets are posted and the perimeter is secure. Food remains a constant source of misery and occasional food poisoning. The basic legionary diet consists of grain, usually barley or wheat, which you grind yourself and bake into bread that could double as a weapon. Olive oil, when available, provides fat and flavour. Salt, absolutely crucial for preservation and health, is so valuable that part of your pay comes in salt, rations, hence the phrase, worth his salt, which you'll learn to appreciate when you see what happens to men who don't get enough sodium in their diet. Meat is rare and usually comes from animals that were already dying when you found them. Fresh vegetables exist only in your dreams and the gardens of officers' wives. You supplement your rations with whatever you can forage, buy, or steal, depending on local attitudes toward Roman soldiers and how desperate you've become. The wine, mixed with water to prevent intoxication and extend supplies, tastes like someone fermented disappointment, but it's safer than local water sources and provides calories that help you function. Getting properly drunk is possible but dangerous. A hungover legionary is a dead legionary when the alarm sounds at midnight because raiders have decided to test your perimeter defences. Hygiene becomes a luxury you remember fondly from your civilian days. Baths are communal, infrequent, and often involve water that's been used by everyone else in your century. Soap is expensive and rare. Dental care consists of chewing on twigs and hoping your teeth don't rot out of your skull before your 25 years are up. Deodorant hasn't been invented, and after a few months on campaign, you stop noticing how badly everyone smells because you smell just as bad. Your gear requires constant maintenance because your life depends on it functioning properly. Armour needs cleaning, oiling, and repair. Weapons must be sharp, balanced, and ready for use at a moment's notice. Leather needs conditioning to prevent cracking. Metal requires protection from rust. This maintenance never ends, and neglecting it can mean the difference between life and death when the barbarians come calling again. The social hierarchy in the Legion is brutal and unforgiving. Centurions rule their centuries with absolute authority backed by the vine staff and the support of higher command. Optios, the seconds in command, are usually centurions in training, which means they're trying to prove their worthiness by being even harder on the men than necessary. Veterans lord their experience over new recruits, and everyone looks down on auxiliaries, the non-citizen troops who fight alongside the legions but receive less pay and respect. Promotion is possible but rare, and usually requires either exceptional skill, exceptional luck, or exceptional willingness to brown-nose the right officers. Most legionaries serve their full term as basic soldiers, never rising above the rank they entered with. The few who do advance often pay for their elevation with pieces of themselves, literally and figuratively. Disease kills more legionaries than enemy action, a fact that would surprise anyone who gets their knowledge of Roman warfare from movies. Dysentery sweeps through camps like wildfire. Malaria claims victims in swampy regions. Typhus spreads wherever sanitation breaks down. Infected wounds fester and turn fatal. Simple. Illnesses that modern medicine handles easily become death sentences when your medical support consists of herbs, prayer, and hope. The constant threat of death creates a unique bond among legionaries. These men become closer than family because they're the only ones who truly understand what you're going through. They've seen you soil yourself in terror, watched you kill your first enemy, held you while you wept for fallen comrades. They know your weaknesses, your fears, your desperate hopes for survival, and they share all of these things because they're in the same situation. But this closeness comes with a price. When your tent mate dies, you don't just lose a friend, you lose a piece of your own humanity. After the first few deaths, you start building emotional walls to protect yourself. After a dozen deaths, you stop learning new recruits' names until they've survived their first battle. After 20 deaths, you realise you've become something harder and colder than the boy who left his village full of dreams about serving the Empire. The letters from home become both blessing and curse. If your family can write, which is unlikely, and if they can afford to send messages, which is even less likely, you might receive word from your village once or twice a year. These letters tell you about harvests you'll never see, weddings you'll never attend, and deaths you couldn't prevent. Your sister married the baker's son. Your father's back is getting worse. The roof on your family's hut collapsed during the last storm. Each piece of news feels like it's happening to someone else's life, someone you used to be but can barely remember. Money becomes an obsession because it represents the only tangible connection to your future. Your pay, when it comes, is modest and often delayed. The Empire has a tendency to prioritise current military needs over past promises to soldiers. When you do get paid, a significant portion goes toward replacing worn-out gear, bribing officials for minor favours, and buying food that isn't actively trying to poison you. What's left gets hidden in places you hope won't be discovered by thieves, tax collectors, or your own desperate tent mates. The promise of land upon retirement sounds wonderful until you realise where that land is located. It's usually on the frontier, in recently conquered territory, where the locals view Roman veterans as unwelcome reminders of their defeat. Your retirement farm might be fertile and well-positioned, but is also likely to be attacked by raiders who see isolated Roman settlements as convenient targets. Many veterans spend their golden years fighting the same battles they thought they'd left behind, except now they're older, slower, and fighting alone. Religion in the Legion is a practical affair rather than a spiritual journey. You pray to Mars before battle because it seems like the sensible thing to do. You offer sacrifices to Fortuna because luck is clearly a finite resource that needs to be carefully managed. You participate in unit rituals because refusing would mark you as different, and different soldiers tend to have shorter lifespans. The gods you worship aren't necessarily the ones you believed in back home, but rather the deities who seem most likely to keep you breathing until tomorrow. The cult of Mithras becomes particularly popular among legionaries because it promises salvation through trial and brotherhood. The underground temples carved into rock faces or built beneath camps offer a sense of mystery and belonging that's hard to find elsewhere in military life. The rituals involve pain, darkness, and symbolic death, and rebirth, themes that resonate strongly with men who face actual death and rebirth on a regular basis. Plus, it's exclusively male, which means it's one place where you don't have to pretend to be civilized for the benefit of officers' wives. Speaking of officers, the gap between their experience and yours is vast enough to swallow entire armies. While you're sleeping 8 to a tent and eating bread that could be used as building material, your commanding officers are dining on imported delicacies and sleeping in comfortable quarters with actual beds. They make tactical decisions based on maps and reports, while you implement those decisions with your blood and bones. Some officers are competent leaders who genuinely care about their men's welfare. Others are political appointees who view their military service as a stepping stone to higher office and regard legionaries as expendable resources. The worst officers are the ones who've never actually fought in the front lines, but still feel qualified to lecture veterans about courage and duty. These armchair generals, usually young nobles completing their mandatory military service, have a talent for making bad situations worse through their inexperience and arrogance. They're the ones who order unnecessary attacks because they want to look aggressive in their reports to Rome. They're the ones who get lost during marches because they won't admit they don't know how to read a map. And they're the ones who retreat to safety while ordering their men to fight to the last man. But even good officers can't protect you from the simple mathematics of imperial expansion. Rome's appetite for conquest is unlimited, but its supply of experienced legionaries is finite. This means you'll be asked to do more with less, fight harder enemies with worn-out equipment, and hold larger territories with smaller forces. Each successful campaign creates new borders that need to be defended, new populations that need to be controlled, and new enemies who've learned from watching Rome defeat their neighbours. The Parthians, for instance, fight nothing like the Celtic tribes you might have trained against. They're disciplined, well-equipped, and led by commanders who've studied Roman tactics for generations. Their heavy cavalry can punch through formations that would stop Germanic berserkers cold. Their horse archers can pepper your advancing lines with arrows while staying safely out of reach of your javelins. Fighting them requires adapting everything you've learned, and adaptation in combat usually means watching friends die while you figure out what works. Desert warfare brings its own special miseries. Water becomes more precious than gold, and finding it clean enough to drink without dying becomes a constant challenge. The sun beats down with intensity that makes European summers feel like gentle spring mornings. Sand gets into everything, including places you didn't know you had. Your leather equipment cracks and splits. Metal becomes too hot to touch during the day and freezing cold at night. Navigation becomes guesswork because landmarks disappear in shifting dunes and heat mirages. Mountain campaigns test your endurance in different ways. The air gets thin enough that climbing hills feels like drowning slowly. Cold cuts through your gear like it's made of wet cloth. Narrow passes become death traps where a few defenders can hold off entire centuries. Supply lines stretch to the breaking point because pack animals can't carry much weight up steep trails. Local knowledge becomes crucial, which means depending on guides who might be leading you into ambushes for the right price. Naval operations, when they occur, reveal just how little your land-based training prepared you for fighting on water. Ships are cramped, smelly, and constantly moving in ways that make your stomach rebel. Seasickness doesn't care about your reputation for toughness. Combat at sea involves ramming, boarding actions, and the constant possibility of drowning in armour that's designed to sink rather than float. Pirates and enemy fleets both know that Romans are most vulnerable when they can't form their traditional formations on solid ground. But perhaps the most insidious enemy you face isn't foreign armies or harsh terrain. It's time itself. Each year of service grinds away another piece of who you used to be. Your body accumulates damage that never fully heals. Your mind builds defences against horror that also block out joy. Your capacity for civilian life diminishes as military thinking becomes your default mode for solving problems. The Empire changes you into something that serves its purposes perfectly, but struggles to exist anywhere else. Veteran legionaries often find civilian life more challenging than combat. The skills that kept you alive in the Legion, hypervigilance, instant obedience to authority, willingness to use violence to solve problems, don't translate well to peaceful occupations. Former soldiers frequently drift toward careers that utilize their military experience. Town guards, bodyguards for wealthy merchants, trainers for new recruits, or mercenaries working for anyone willing to pay for professional violence. The bonds forged in military service become both anchor and chain. Your fellow veterans are the only people who truly understand what you've experienced, but they're also reminders of traumas you'd rather forget. Reunions become exercises in shared remembrance of horrors that civilians can't comprehend. You find yourself talking about battles from decades past as if they happened yesterday while struggling to remember what you did last week. Sleep becomes a complicated negotiation with your own mind. Your body learns to rest while remaining partially alert for danger that may never come. Dreams blend memories of real battles with imagined threats. You wake up reaching for weapons that aren't there, in response to attack calls that exist only in your subconscious. The hypervigilance that kept you alive in hostile territory becomes a permanent feature of your psychological landscape. Marriage and family life present unique challenges for veterans. How do you explain to a spouse why sudden noises make you dive for cover? How do you tell your children bedtime stories when the only stories you know involve death and destruction? How do you participate in community celebrations when crowds make you nervous and loud noises trigger combat reflexes? Many veterans find that their families love them, but don't really know them, because the person who came back from the legions isn't the same person who left home 25 years earlier. The medical consequences of military service follow you long after your discharge. Joints worn down by carrying heavy loads over thousands of miles, scars that ache in cold weather, hearing damage from battle noise and construction work, respiratory problems from breathing dust, smoke, and gods know what else during siege operations, digestive issues from years of eating questionable food and drinking contaminated water. The Empire provides no ongoing healthcare for veterans, so these problems become personal challenges to manage as best you can. But for all its brutality and horror, the Legion also provides something that civilian life often lacks: purpose and brotherhood. Despite everything you've endured, despite the friends you've lost and the innocence you've sacrificed, there's a part of you that misses the clarity of military life. In the Legion, you knew exactly what was expected of you. Your role was clear, your duties were defined, and your place in the hierarchy was established. Civilian life, with its ambiguities and competing priorities, can feel chaotic and meaningless by comparison. The Empire you served continues its expansion, grinding through new territories and new populations with fresh legionaries who haven't yet learned what you know. They march with the same confidence you once felt, carrying the same dreams of glory and advancement that motivated your own enlistment. Watching them, you feel a mixture of pity and envy. Pity because you know what awaits them. Envy because they still have hope. And yet, despite everything, despite the pain and loss and disillusionment, you survived. You endured 25 years in the most brutal military machine the world had ever seen. You witnessed the rise and fall of emperors, the conquest of nations, and the expansion of civilization to the ends of the known world. You were part of something larger than yourself, something that changed the course of human history. That knowledge doesn't heal your wounds or restore your youth, but it provides a kind of meaning that few people in any era get to experience. The Roman legion wasn't just a military force, it was a transformation machine that took ordinary men and forged them into instruments of imperial will. The process was cruel, efficient, and largely irreversible. Those who survived it were never quite the same afterward, marked forever by their service to an empire that demanded everything, and gave back just enough to keep them breathing. You wouldn't last a day in the Roman legion, not because you lacked courage or strength, but because it would remake you into someone you wouldn't recognize, and that transformation, once begun, could never be undone. The romance of military glory dies quickly when you realize that Roman engineering projects are basically death sentences with architectural ambitions. You think building roads sounds noble? Try hauling 50-pound stones up a mountain in full armour, while Germanic warriors take potshots at you from behind every tree. The famous Roman roads weren't built by passionate civil engineers with blueprints and coffee breaks. They were carved through hostile territory by exhausted legionaries who'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Every mile of perfectly straight highway required tons of stone quarried by hand, foundations dug through rock and root, and surfaces levelled to standards that would make modern contractors weep. And you, lucky soldier, get to do all of this while wearing 60 pounds of gear and watching for ambushes, because nothing says easy target like a Roman work crew focused on moving boulders instead of scanning the tree line for painted warriors with sharp objects and bad attitudes. Bridge construction is even worse. Roman engineers loved their bridges, massive stone spans that could carry entire legions across rivers that barbarians thought were natural barriers. Sounds impressive until you're the one standing waist-deep in freezing water, trying to position foundation stones while current tries to sweep you downstream and enemy archers use you for target practice. Your engineering education consists of lift this, carry that, don't die, delivered by a centurion who learned architecture by watching other people build things and occasionally hitting them with his vine staff when the measurements looked wrong. Aqueduct work combines all the worst aspects of construction with the added thrill of working at heights that would make modern safety inspectors have nervous breakdowns. You're balancing on narrow stone arches hundreds of feet above valleys, mortaring joints with materials mixed according to recipes passed down through generations of masons who probably died in construction accidents. One slip, one moment of inattention, one gust of wind at the wrong time, and you become a very flat reminder to your fellow workers about the importance of secure footing. But the real masterpiece of Roman sadism was siege engineering. When the legion encountered a fortified city that refused to surrender immediately, which was most of them, you got to build siege works. This meant constructing massive earthen ramps against enemy walls while defenders dropped rocks, boiling oil, and flaming projectiles on your head. You dug trenches under constant missile fire, built wooden towers that enemies tried to burn down, and assembled catapults from plans that may or may not have been drawn by someone who understood basic physics. The siege of Masada wasn't just a military victory. It was a construction project that killed more Romans from exhaustion and accidents than from enemy action. Building a ramp up a mountain face while Jewish defenders fought desperately for their lives required moving thousands of tons of earth and stone by hand. Every shovelful of dirt had to be carried up increasingly steep slopes, while arrows whistled overhead and boulders crashed down from above. The fact that Romans completed the project says less about their engineering genius and more about their willingness to sacrifice unlimited numbers of soldiers to achieve their goals. Winter construction work deserves special mention because it combines all the normal miseries of Roman engineering with weather that actively wants to kill you. Try mixing mortar when the temperature is below freezing and your hands are so numb you can't feel the tools. Attempt to quarry stone when the rock face is covered in ice and your footing consists of frozen mud and prayer. Build wooden frameworks when the lumber splits like glass and every metal tool conducts cold straight into your bones. The materials you work with aren't exactly modern grade either. Roman concrete was revolutionary for its time, but mixing it required volcanic ash from specific regions, transported across vast distances by supply trains that frequently got lost, attacked, or simply forgot where they were supposed to be going. Your lime came from burning limestone in kilns that filled the air with caustic smoke. Your tools were hand-forged iron implements that broke regularly and couldn't be replaced until the next supply convoy arrived, assuming it arrived at all. Quality control in Roman construction projects was enforced through a simple system. If your work collapsed and killed someone important, you died. If your measurements were wrong and the foundation shifted, you died. If your section of wall failed during an enemy assault, you died. This created a remarkably focused workforce, though not necessarily a happy one. Veterans learned to double-check everything, triple-check anything, load-bearing, and pray to multiple gods before declaring any project complete. The logistics of feeding construction crews in remote locations became nightmares that would challenge modern military planners. You can't build a fortress in the middle of nowhere without moving enormous quantities of food, tools, materials, and replacement workers to sites that often lacked roads, harbours, or any other infrastructure. Supply trains stretched for miles, required military escorts, and moved at the speed of the slowest ox cart laden with stone blocks and thoroughly irritated legionaries. Medical care during construction projects was primitive even by Roman standards. Crushed limbs got amputated if you were lucky, left to fester if you weren't. Cuts from sharp tools were sewn up with whatever thread was available, and treated with wine if any could be spared from the officer's personal supplies. Back injuries, incredibly common when moving heavy stones by hand, were addressed through the time-tested method of walk it off or find another job. Burns from hot metal or lime were treated with whatever folk remedies the camp followers remembered from their grandmothers. The social dynamics of construction crews created their own special tensions. Skilled masons and carpenters, often recruited from conquered territories, looked down on common legionaries who were expected to provide muscle but not brains. Engineers, usually educated Romans from good families, treated everyone else as disposable labour. Centurions, caught between impossible deadlines and inadequate resources, took out their frustrations on whoever was closest when things went wrong. Competition between units could turn deadly when commanders decided to motivate their men through rivalry. Racing to complete sections of wall or bridge led to corner cutting that killed workers, and produce structures that failed at inconvenient moments. Sabotage between competing crews wasn't unheard of, especially when bonuses or preferred assignments were at stake. Nothing builds unit cohesion like knowing that the sentry working next to you might be actively trying to make your section collapse. The environmental damage caused by major Roman construction projects would horrify modern environmentalists. Building the Colosseum required stripping entire forests for timber, quarrying mountains for stone, and rerouting water sources to fill the arena for naval battles. Local ecosystems were obliterated without a second thought. Rivers were diverted, wetlands were drained, and hillsides were carved away to provide materials for monuments to imperial glory. Weather delays could stretch projects from months into years, turning temporary assignments into permanent postings in places no sane person would choose to live. Soldiers who signed up for adventure found themselves spending entire enlistments moving stones in Armenia or building watchtowers in northern Britain, where the sun set for about 15 minutes during summer and never rose at all during winter. Morale plummeted, desertion rates climbed, and suicide became common enough that commanders stopped mentioning it in their reports to Rome. The completion of major projects often meant immediate reassignment to new construction sites, because the Empire's appetite for infrastructure was infinite, while its supply of experienced construction crews was decidedly finite. Veterans who had just finished building a fortress in Germania might find themselves marching to Britannia to start work on Hadrian's Wall. There was no rest, no rotation home, just an endless cycle of digging, lifting, carrying and building until your body gave out or an enemy arrow found its mark. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of Roman construction work was its permanence. The roads you built with your blood and sweat would outlast your great-grandchildren. The bridges you erected while dodging arrows would carry Roman legions for centuries. The walls you raised, stone by stone, would stand long after your name was forgotten and your bones had turned to dust. You created monuments to an empire that viewed you as expendable, building your own memorials while knowing that history would remember the structures but not the men who died creating them. The technical knowledge required for Roman construction was passed down through apprenticeship systems that relied heavily on watching experienced workers and hoping you learned enough to avoid fatal mistakes. There were no engineering schools, no safety manuals, no standardized procedures beyond make it strong enough to last and pretty enough to impress visiting dignitaries. Innovation happened through trial and error, with emphasis on the error part since successful techniques were closely guarded secrets, while failures were publicly demonstrated through collapsed buildings and dead workers. Tool maintenance became a constant concern because broken equipment in remote construction sites couldn't be easily replaced. You learned to forge your own iron, repair wooden handles, and improvise solutions using whatever materials were available locally. A broken pick handle might be replaced with a spear shaft. A cracked hammerhead could be bound with leather strips and prayers. Everything had to be maintained, modified, and made to last, because the nearest replacement might be hundreds of miles away. The psychological toll of construction work was different from combat stress, but equally damaging. Instead of brief periods of terror followed by relief, you faced months or years of grinding physical labour with no clear end in sight. Your body deteriorated gradually under constant strain. Your hands became permanently calloused and scarred. Your back developed chronic pain from lifting stones. Your shoulders ached from carrying loads. Your knees complained about climbing scaffolding. Every day brought new minor injuries that accumulated into major disabilities. The relationships you formed with fellow construction workers were complicated by the knowledge that advancement often came at someone else's expense. If a foreman position opened up, you might find yourself competing against men who had shared their food with you during lean times and covered for you when you were too exhausted to work effectively. Professional jealousy mixed with genuine camaraderie in ways that created lasting tensions within units. And through it all, the Empire continued expanding, creating new frontiers that required new fortifications, new roads, new aqueducts, new monuments to Roman power. Each successful conquest generated more construction projects, which required more soldiers, which meant more young men learning that military service involved far more digging than fighting, and that glory was something that happened to other people in other places. The irony wasn't lost on veterans that they were building the infrastructure that would make future conquest easier, while simultaneously creating their own replacements. Every road they built would carry fresh legions to new campaigns. Every fortress they erected would house new soldiers who hadn't yet learned that military engineering was just organised misery with better tools. Your construction work didn't end with major projects either. Daily camp construction meant that even on the march, you spent your evenings digging defensive ditches, building palisades, and creating fortifications that would be abandoned the next morning. Roman military doctrine required that every night's stop be turned into a temporary fortress capable of withstanding attack. This meant that exhausted soldiers who had marched 20 miles in full gear then spent several more hours with shovels and axes before they could even think about food or rest. The tools themselves were designed more for effectiveness than comfort. Roman picks were heavy enough to break through rocky soil, but also heavy enough to exhaust the men using them. Shovels were built to move large quantities of earth quickly, but weren't ergonomically designed to prevent back injuries. Hammers and chisels were forged for durability rather than ease of use. Everything was made to last through decades of hard use, regardless of what that use did to the human bodies wielding them. Material quality varied wildly depending on supply lines and local resources. Sometimes you worked with excellent iron tools forged by master smiths. Other times you made do with soft metal implements that bent under normal use and required constant resharpening. Stone quality ranged from perfect building blocks that fit together like puzzles to crumbling rubble that barely held together long enough to be mortared in place. Wood might be perfectly seasoned timber or green lumber that warped and split as it dried. The pace of work was determined not by human limitations but by imperial deadlines that often bore no relationship to physical reality. Emperors wanted their monuments completed in time for specific celebrations. Generals needed fortifications finished before enemy reinforcements arrived. Provincial governors demanded infrastructure projects be completed before their terms of office expired. These political pressures translated into impossible schedules that were enforced through the traditional Roman methods of flogging, execution, and creative punishment. Weather created additional complications that no amount of planning could fully address. Rain turned construction sites into muddy swamps where footing became treacherous and materials became waterlogged and unworkable. Wind knocked down scaffolding and made precision work impossible. Snow and ice halted most projects entirely, while still requiring soldiers to maintain equipment and prevent structural damage from freezing. Heat exhaustion claimed workers regularly during summer projects in southern provinces. The specialised knowledge required for different types of construction meant that experienced workers became valuable commodities who were traded between projects like particularly useful pieces of equipment. A mason who understood arch construction might find himself reassigned repeatedly to bridge projects across the empire. A carpenter skilled in siege engine construction could spend his entire career building catapults and ballistas for different legions. This specialisation created a class of soldier craftsmen who were essential to Roman expansion, but never quite fit into the normal military hierarchy. Safety procedures were minimal and usually consisted of try not to die in ways that delay the project. Scaffolding was built from whatever lumber was available and held together with rope and optimism. Safety lines were unknown concepts. Hard hats hadn't been invented. Eye protection meant squinting and hoping for the best. The attitude toward workplace injuries was essentially rub some dirt on it and get back to work, unless the injury was severe enough to prevent further labour, in which case you became someone else's problem. The environmental conditions at construction sites were often deliberately chosen to be as miserable as possible because strategic locations rarely coincided with pleasant living conditions. Bridges needed to cross rivers at their narrowest points, which were usually in mountainous regions with terrible weather. Fortifications were built on high ground that was exposed to wind and storms. Border walls ran through deserts, swamps, and frozen wastelands that tested human endurance to its limits. But despite all the misery, despite the accidents and injuries and endless labour, some soldiers found pride in their construction work. They could see their efforts taking shape in permanent form. Unlike battles, which ended in destruction and death, building projects created something lasting and useful. Veterans could return years later and point to bridges or walls or aqueducts and say, "I built that. It was a form of immortality that few people in the ancient world could achieve." The skills learned through military construction work often translated into post-service careers for veterans who survived their 25 years. Former legionaries became civilian contractors, master builders, and engineering consultants for private projects. Their combination of technical knowledge and military discipline made them valuable employees for wealthy Romans who wanted reliable construction work. Some veterans established their own businesses, using their military connections to secure contracts for private villas, temples, and commercial buildings. The legacy of Roman military construction remains visible today across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Roads built by exhausted legionaries still carry traffic 2,000 years later. Aqueducts constructed by soldiers who never expected to see their homes again continue to supply water to modern cities. Walls erected by men who are paid in salt and hope still define the boundaries of nations. The monuments they built outlasted the empire that worked them to death creating them. But for every visible remnant of Roman engineering, thousands of soldiers died in accidents, from disease or from exhaustion, without leaving any trace beyond their contribution to imperial infrastructure. They were the anonymous builders of Western civilization, remembered not as individuals but as part of the vast machine that created the physical foundation of European culture. Their names are lost, but their work endures, a permanent reminder that empire was built not just through conquest, but through the systematic destruction of human bodies in service of architectural ambition. The Roman legion didn't just break your body and spirit through combat and construction. It systematically destroyed your ability to think for yourself, replacing your individual judgment with absolute obedience to authority. This wasn't an accident or a side effect of military training. It was the primary objective, because Rome understood that free-thinking soldiers were dangerous soldiers. Your transformation from citizen to cog began the moment you swore your oath. From that point forward, questioning orders wasn't just discouraged, it was literally treasonous. The centurion's word became law, the tribune's suggestion became divine command, and the legate's casual observation became holy scripture that you followed without hesitation or thought. This wasn't just military discipline, this was systematic psychological conditioning designed to override 20 years of civilian thinking patterns and replace them with instant, unquestioning compliance. The process started with simple commands. Stand here, march there, hold your shield this way, stab the dummy like that. Harmless instructions that seemed reasonable and necessary for military effectiveness. But gradually the commands became more complex, more personal, more invasive. Sleep when we sleep. Tell you to sleep. Eat what we give you to eat. Think what we want you to think. Believe what serves the empire's interests. Your opinions, preferences, and personal beliefs were systematically identified and eliminated through a combination of exhaustion, peer pressure, and punishment. Express doubt about a military objective, and you'd find yourself on permanent latrine duty. Question the wisdom of marching through hostile territory with inadequate supplies, and your rations would mysteriously disappear. Suggest that maybe the locals have legitimate grievances against Roman occupation, and you'd wake up to find your gear scattered across the camp, and your tent mates looking at you like you'd grown a second head. The brilliance of this system was that it made resistance seem not just futile, but insane. When everyone around you accepts the same basic assumptions about Roman superiority, imperial destiny, and the necessity of absolute obedience, questioning those assumptions marks you as mentally unstable rather than independently minded. Dissent becomes not political opposition, but psychological disorder, something to be cured through isolation, punishment, or elimination. Religion played a crucial role in this mental conditioning. You weren't just serving Rome, the political entity. You were serving the gods who had chosen Rome to rule the world. Every victory proved divine favour. Every defeat was blamed on insufficient piety or moral corruption among the troops. This cosmic framework made resistance not just treasonous, but blasphemous, rebellion against the natural order of the universe itself. The legal system reinforced these mental chains through concepts like collective punishment and unit responsibility. If one man in your century committed a crime, everyone paid the price. This created powerful incentives for soldiers to police each other's thoughts as well as actions. Your tent mates became informants and enforcers, watching for signs of disloyalty or independent thinking that might bring punishment down on the entire group. Social isolation completed the conditioning process. Letters from home were read by officers before reaching you, edited or destroyed if they contained inconvenient news or contrary opinions. Civilians were generally forbidden in military camps except under strictly controlled circumstances. Your only social contacts were other soldiers who had undergone the same conditioning process, creating an echo chamber where Roman propaganda was the only voice anyone heard. The physical exhaustion and constant stress made critical thinking nearly impossible, even if you still wanted to engage in it. When you're operating on minimal sleep, inadequate nutrition, and constant fear of punishment, your brain doesn't have the energy to analyse complex political or moral questions. You default to following orders because thinking requires resources you simply don't possess. This conditioning was so effective that many veterans never fully recovered their ability to think independently even after discharge. They'd spent decades having every decision made for them, every opinion provided by authority figures, every moral judgment handed down from above. Civilian life, with its requirement for personal choice and individual responsibility, became overwhelming and anxiety-provoking. Many former legionaries gravitated toward careers that replicated military hierarchy and clear chains of command because freedom was too terrifying to handle. The Empire's treatment of military families served as additional leverage for ensuring compliance. Soldiers' wives and children lived in settlements near military bases, completely dependent on imperial goodwill for their survival. Threaten the status quo, and your family might find themselves relocated to less pleasant accommodations, or simply forgotten when supply convoys distributed food and necessities. Your personal rebellion could doom not just yourself, but everyone you cared about. Information control was absolute and ruthless. News from other parts of the Empire was filtered through official channels and presented in ways that supported imperial policy. You might hear about victories in Germania, but not about rebellions in Gaul. Reports of successful campaigns would be widely circulated, while disasters were minimized or blamed on local commanders rather than systemic problems. This created a distorted worldview where Roman power seemed unshakable, and resistance appeared futile. The language itself became a tool of control. Military Latin included specific terms for concepts like duty, honour, loyalty, and sacrifice that carried emotional weight beyond their literal meanings. These words triggered conditioned responses that bypassed rational analysis. When a centurion invoked your duty to Rome, he wasn't making a logical argument. He was pushing psychological buttons that had been carefully installed through years of conditioning. Career advancement within the military hierarchy required not just competence, but demonstrated loyalty to the system. Promotion boards evaluated candidates based on their adherence to official ideology as much as their military skills. Officers who showed too much independence or creativity in their thinking found their careers stalled, while those who parroted the party line advanced rapidly. This created powerful incentives for ambitious soldiers to internalize imperial propaganda rather than merely pretending to believe it. The few soldiers who managed to maintain some degree of independent thought learned to hide it carefully. They developed elaborate mental strategies for compartmentalizing their private beliefs, while publicly conforming to military expectations. These men became expert actors, playing the role of loyal legionaries while secretly maintaining their own moral and political convictions. But the psychological cost of this constant deception was enormous, leading to depression, anxiety, and a sense of alienation that could last for decades. Mental illness, when it occurred, was interpreted through the lens of military discipline rather than medical understanding. Soldiers who broke down under psychological pressure were seen as weak or cowardly rather than sick. Treatment consisted of punishment, additional duty, or transfer to less demanding assignments. The concept that the military system itself might be causing mental health problems was literally unthinkable within the imperial framework. The integration of foreign auxiliaries into Roman military units served both strategic and psychological purposes. These non-citizen troops provided specialized skills and local knowledge, but they also served as examples of what happened to peoples who resisted Rome. Seeing former enemies now fighting loyally for the empire reinforced the message that resistance was futile, and that intelligent people eventually recognized Roman superiority. Combat trauma was reframed as a character-building experience rather than psychological damage. Veterans who suffered from what we would now recognize as PTSD were told they had been strengthened by their experiences and made more capable of serving the empire. Nightmares, flashbacks, and emotional numbness were interpreted as signs of spiritual toughening rather than mental injury. This prevented soldiers from seeking help or even acknowledging that they needed it. The retirement system was designed to maintain psychological control even after active service ended. Veterans received land grants in frontier regions where they served as a first line of defence against barbarian incursions. This meant that even in retirement, former legionaries remained part of the imperial military system, subject to recall in emergencies and responsible for maintaining Roman control over hostile populations. Religious festivals and ceremonies reinforced military conditioning through elaborate rituals that celebrated Roman power and divine favour. These events combined entertainment with propaganda, creating positive emotional associations with imperial ideology. Soldiers learned to feel genuine joy and pride when participating in ceremonies that glorified the system that was systematically destroying their individuality. The documentation system tracked individual soldiers throughout their careers, noting not just their military performance, but their political reliability and ideological commitment. This created permanent records that could be used to reward loyalty or punish dissent long after specific incidents had been forgotten. Soldiers knew they were being watched and evaluated constantly, which encouraged self-censorship and conformity. Education within the military was strictly controlled and limited to subjects that supported imperial objectives. Soldiers might learn to read and write, but only enough to follow written orders and maintain basic records. They were taught history, but only the version that portrayed Rome as the inevitable victor in every conflict and the natural ruler of the civilized world. Geography lessons focused on strategic considerations rather than cultural understanding. The medical system reinforced psychological conditioning by treating mental resistance as a form of illness. Soldiers who questioned orders or expressed doubt about imperial policy were sometimes subjected to treatments designed to cure their rebellious tendencies. These might include isolation, dietary restrictions, physical punishment, or transfer to undesirable assignments until the patient demonstrated proper thinking. Communication between different military units was carefully controlled to prevent the spread of dissenting ideas or unauthorized information. Letters between soldiers in different legions were monitored and censored. Transfers between units were managed to break up potential sources of organized resistance. Even casual conversations between troops from different commands were supervised when possible. The Empire's treatment of military prisoners and deserters served as constant reminders of what happened to soldiers who tried to escape the system. Public executions, floggings, and other punishments were designed not just to eliminate troublemakers, but to terrorize potential dissidents into compliance. The message was clear. The only way out of the Roman military was through completion of service or death. Veterans' benefits were structured to maintain loyalty long after discharge. Pensions, land grants, and citizenship privileges could be revoked if former soldiers engaged in activities deemed harmful to imperial interests. This meant that even decades after leaving active service, veterans remained subject to political control and afraid to express opinions that might be interpreted as disloyal. The psychological conditioning was so thorough that many soldiers internalized their oppression to the point where they genuinely believed in Roman superiority and imperial destiny. They weren't just pretending to support the system to avoid punishment. They had been transformed into true believers who would voluntarily defend the empire even when no one was watching or threatening them. This mental transformation was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Roman military service. Physical wounds healed, eventually. Bodies recovered from exhaustion and malnutrition. But the psychological conditioning lasted for life, creating generations of men who'd been systematically stripped of their ability to think critically about power, authority, and justice. They became not just soldiers, but evangelists for the system that had destroyed their minds, spreading imperial ideology wherever they went and ensuring that Roman control extended far beyond the reach of Roman armies. The empire didn't just conquer territory, it conquered souls, turning free men into willing slaves who thanked their masters for the privilege of serving. And the most terrifying part was that by the end of their service, most legionaries couldn't imagine wanting anything else. The psychological destruction was so complete that even the empire's collapse couldn't free you from its mental chains. When barbarian armies finally overwhelmed Roman defences and the last emperors fled or died, former legionaries found themselves lost in a world that no longer needed their particular brand of disciplined brutality. The skills that had made you valuable to Rome, instant obedience, tactical thinking, willingness to kill on command, became liabilities in a world where survival required adaptation and independent judgment. Your retirement, if you lived long enough to see it, wasn't the peaceful farm life promised by recruiters. It was a slow descent into irrelevance punctuated by moments of terror when your conditioning kicked in at inappropriate times. The sound of metal clanging in a blacksmith shop could send you diving for cover. A child's wooden sword could trigger combat reflexes that left you shaking and confused. Crowds made you nervous because your training taught you to see every civilian as a potential threat or asset to be managed. The land grant you received as a retirement benefit came with strings attached that weren't mentioned in the recruitment speeches. Your farm was located on the frontier, usually in territory recently conquered from people who remembered exactly how they'd lost their homeland. Your neighbours weren't fellow veterans sharing war stories around communal fires. They were displaced locals who viewed you as a symbol of everything they'd lost and everyone they'd buried during the conquest. Farming itself presented challenges that military training hadn't prepared you for. 25 years of following orders left you poorly equipped to make the hundreds of daily decisions required to run an agricultural operation. When to plant, what crops to grow, how to manage livestock. These questions required exactly the kind of independent thinking that the Legion had systematically beaten out of you. Many veterans failed as farmers not because they lacked physical strength or work ethic, but because they couldn't function without someone telling them what to do every hour of every day. The economic realities of veteran life were harsher than anyone anticipated. Your military pension, when it came, was often paid in devalued currency or promised land that turned out to be worthless swamp or desert. The Empire's financial problems became your financial problems as inflation ate away at fixed payments, and provincial governments defaulted on their obligations to former soldiers. The comfortable retirement you dreamed of during long marches turned into a desperate struggle to avoid starvation. Marriage and family relationships suffered under the weight of your psychological conditioning. How do you explain to a wife why you can't sleep without checking the door locks 3 times? How do you tell your children why daddy sometimes stares at nothing for hours while his hands shake? How do you participate in village celebrations when crowds trigger hypervigilance and loud noises make you reach for weapons that aren't there? The person who came home from the legions wasn't the same person who'd left 25 years earlier, and families struggled to love someone they no longer recognized. Your fellow veterans became both salvation and torment. They were the only people who truly understood what you'd experienced, but they were also walking reminders of traumas you'd rather forget. Veteran gatherings turned into exercises in shared remembrance of horrors that couldn't be explained to civilians. You found yourself reliving battles from decades past while struggling to remember what you'd done yesterday. The bonds forged in military service became chains that kept you anchored to a past that offered nothing but pain. Religious life presented its own complications for former legionaries. The gods you'd worshipped during your service, Mars, Fortuna, Mithras, weren't particularly helpful when it came to growing wheat or raising children. Civilian deities seemed weak and distant compared to the immediate demanding presence of military gods, who had required constant sacrifice and attention. Many veterans found themselves spiritually adrift, unable to connect with peaceful religious practices after decades of worship that centered around violence and death. The Empire's treatment of veteran complaints revealed the true nature of Roman gratitude. When former soldiers petitioned for better benefits or medical care, they were told to be grateful for what they'd already received. When they organised to demand fair treatment, they were branded as seditious troublemakers who threatened public order. The same system that had praised their loyalty and sacrifice while they were useful now viewed them as burdens to be managed rather than heroes to be honoured. Physical health problems accumulated like compound interest throughout your service and came due with brutal efficiency during retirement. Joints worn down by carrying heavy loads over thousands of miles. Organs damaged by years of drinking contaminated water and eating spoiled food. Respiratory systems compromised by breathing smoke, dust, and gods knew what else during siege operations. The Empire provided no ongoing healthcare for veterans, so these problems became personal challenges to manage with whatever folk remedies you could afford. Mental health issues were even more devastating because they were invisible and misunderstood. What we might recognise today as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder were interpreted as character flaws or spiritual failings. Veterans who couldn't adjust to civilian life were seen as weak or ungrateful rather than injured. Treatment consisted of advice to work harder, drink less, and stop complaining about problems that everyone else seemed to handle just fine. The social hierarchy that had defined your entire adult life disappeared upon discharge, leaving you without clear guidelines for how to interact with people who hadn't shared your experiences. In the Legion, everyone knew exactly where they stood in relation to everyone else. Civilians operated according to rules you'd never learned and couldn't intuitively understand. Simple social interactions became minefields where the wrong word or gesture could lead to conflict you weren't equipped to handle diplomatically. Employment opportunities for veterans were limited, and usually involved some form of violence. Town guards, bodyguards for wealthy merchants, trainers for new recruits, mercenaries working for whoever could afford professional soldiers, these were the careers that utilised your military skills without requiring the civilian social competencies you'd never developed. Many veterans found themselves trapped in cycles of violence because it was the only work they knew how to do. The younger generation of Romans had no context for understanding what veterans had sacrificed for the Empire. To them, former legionaries were just old men with scars and stories that got more dramatic with each telling. The glory and honour that had supposedly motivated your service seemed abstract and meaningless. To people who'd never faced an enemy charge or watched friends die for imperial ambitions, your sacrifice became invisible, reduced to footnotes in histories that focused on emperors and generals, rather than the common soldiers who'd made their victories possible. Some veterans found purpose in passing on their knowledge to new recruits, but even this became a source of frustration as military tactics and equipment evolved beyond their experience. The legion you'd served in was different from the one being trained for current threats. Your hard-won expertise became obsolete, another reminder that the Empire had moved on without you and no longer needed what you had to offer. The collapse of Roman power in various provinces created special problems for veterans who'd settled in frontier regions. When imperial authority withdrew, former legionaries found themselves isolated in hostile territory without support or protection. Local populations who'd been kept in check by Roman military presence suddenly had opportunities to settle old scores with the soldiers who'd conquered their ancestors. Many veterans died violent deaths not in glorious battles, but in midnight raids by people seeking revenge for decades-old grievances. Disease and malnutrition claimed veterans at rates that would have shocked military planners who'd calculated casualty figures for active campaigns. The men who'd survived Germanic ambushes and Parthian arrow storms died quietly in their huts, from illnesses that could have been easily treated with proper medical care. Dysentery, typhus, infected wounds, simple ailments that modern medicine handles, routinely became death sentences for former soldiers who lacked access to competent physicians. The psychological isolation experienced by many veterans was compounded by their inability to articulate what they'd been through. How do you explain to someone who's never left their village what it feels like to kill another human being? How do you describe the weight of carrying 60 pounds of gear across hostile terrain when your listener has never lifted anything heavier than a sack of grain? The experiences that had defined your adult life became incommunicable memories that set you apart from everyone around you. Financial exploitation of veterans became common as unscrupulous merchants, moneylenders, and officials took advantage of men who'd been trained to follow orders rather than negotiate contracts. Former legionaries found themselves cheated out of land grants, pension payments, and benefits they'd earned through decades of service. The same obedience to authority that had made them valuable soldiers made them easy targets for civilian predators who understood their psychological vulnerabilities. Legal protections for veterans existed on parchment but rarely functioned in practice. Local magistrates were often corrupt or incompetent, more interested in maintaining relationships with wealthy locals than protecting the rights of former soldiers who had no political influence. Veterans who sought justice through official channels usually discovered that the system they'd served faithfully had no interest in serving them. The Empire's promises about veteran benefits had always been more aspirational than actual, dependent on military success, provincial prosperity, and imperial goodwill that could evaporate without warning. When economic pressures mounted or political priorities shifted, veterans found themselves abandoned by the same system that had demanded total loyalty during their service years. The contract they'd signed in blood was apparently written in disappearing ink. Some veterans attempted to maintain their military identity through informal organisations and regular gatherings, but these groups often became focused on past glories rather than present realities. Stories grew in the telling until minor skirmishes became epic battles, and routine patrols transformed into heroic adventures. This nostalgic mythology provided emotional comfort, but did nothing to address the practical problems of veteran life. The few veterans who successfully transitioned to civilian careers often did so by completely abandoning their military identity and pretending their service years had never happened. They learned new skills, adopted civilian mannerisms, and carefully avoided any mention of their time in the legions. This psychological amputation allowed them to function in civilian society, but came at the cost of denying 25 years of their own lives. Medical knowledge about the long-term effects of military service was virtually non-existent, so veterans suffered from conditions that wouldn't be understood or treatable for centuries. Joint problems from carrying heavy loads, respiratory issues from breathing battlefield smoke, digestive disorders from years of poor nutrition, these ailments were seen as natural consequences of aging rather than occupational injuries deserving treatment or compensation. The Empire's attitude toward veteran welfare reflected its broader view of human resources as expendable commodities. Soldiers were valuable while they could fight, useful while they could work, and burdensome once they required care rather than providing service. This utilitarian approach to human life extended beyond the military, but was most visible in the treatment of men who dedicated their adult lives to imperial service. Family relationships often deteriorated under the stress of veteran adjustment problems. Wives who'd waited 25 years for their husbands to return found themselves living with strangers who bore little resemblance to the men they'd married. Children grew up with fathers who were physically present but emotionally unavailable, damaged by experiences they couldn't share or explain. Many veteran families simply fell apart under the weight of unaddressed trauma and unmet expectations. The promise of a Roman citizenship that had motivated many auxiliary troops to enlist proved hollow for veterans who discovered that citizenship without wealth or connections provided few practical benefits. Former soldiers found themselves citizens of an empire that didn't want them, participants in a society that had no place for their skills or experiences. The legal status they'd fought to achieve became just another disappointment in a retirement filled with broken promises. And yet, despite everything, despite the pain and abandonment and slow decline into irrelevance, some part of you missed the clarity of military life. In the Legion, you'd known exactly what was expected of you, exactly where you stood, exactly what your purpose was. Civilian life, with its ambiguities and competing demands, felt chaotic and meaningless by comparison. The brotherhood of arms, the shared hardship, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself, these were experiences that civilian life couldn't replicate. The empire you'd served continued its decline, grinding through fresh territories with new legionaries who hadn't yet learned what you knew. They marched with the same confidence you'd once felt, carrying the same dreams of glory that had motivated your own enlistment. Watching them, you felt a mixture of pity and envy. Pity because you knew what awaited them. Envy because they still had hope. The Roman legion didn't just demand your body for 25 years, it consumed your entire identity, replacing everything you'd been with something that served imperial purposes perfectly, but struggled to exist anywhere else. The machine that created the greatest military force in ancient history did so by systematically destroying the humanity of the men who fed it. You wouldn't last a day in the Roman legion not just because of the physical demands, but because the psychological transformation it required was irreversible. Once broken and remade in Rome's image, you could never again be the person you'd been before taking that oath. The empire got its soldiers, but the men who became those soldiers ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. And that perhaps was the most Roman thing of all. Total victory achieved through total destruction, leaving behind monuments that lasted millennia, built on foundations of human suffering that was forgotten before the mortar dried. The legions conquered the world by first conquering themselves, and the cost of that victory was paid not in gold or territory, but in souls that could never be reclaimed or restored. The Empire's appetite for fresh blood was insatiable, and that hunger extended far beyond the traditional recruiting grounds of Roman citizens. As the legions expanded across 3 continents, and wars multiplied faster than emperors could count them, Rome faced a simple mathematical problem. There weren't enough Romans to fill the ranks of an army that needed to be everywhere at once. Enter the auxiliaries, non-citizen troops who would discover that serving Rome as a foreigner meant experiencing all the brutality of legion life, with half the benefits and twice the suspicion. If you thought being a Roman citizen in the legions was rough, try being a Gallic warrior or Germanic tribesman who'd been recruited, conscripted, or simply rounded up after your people lost a war. You got the same training, the same discipline, the same back-breaking labour, but your pay was lower, your equipment was second-rate, and your chances of surviving long enough to earn citizenship were about as good as a snowball's prospects in a forge fire. Auxiliary recruitment was often less voluntary than Roman officials liked to admit in their reports. Sure, some young men from conquered territories genuinely wanted to serve the empire that had defeated their fathers, but many more found themselves faced with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Join the auxiliaries, and maybe earn citizenship after 25 years, or watch your village get burned down for failing to meet their recruitment quotas. Surprisingly, most people chose the uniform over the flames. The training was identical to what Roman citizens received, with one crucial difference. Everyone knew you were expendable. When the centurions needed someone to test whether that bridge could support a century's weight, guess who got volunteered? When scouts were needed to probe enemy positions in hostile territory, auxiliary units somehow always found themselves at the front of the line. When someone needed to dig latrines in ground that was frozen solid, well, the Romans had more important things to do. Your equipment told the story of your status in the imperial hierarchy. Roman legionaries got the good steel, properly fitted armour, and weapons that had been tested by generations of professional soldiers. Auxiliaries got whatever was left over after the citizens had been equipped. Your sword might be slightly shorter, your shield a bit thinner, your armour pieced together from different sources and held together with leather strips and optimism. It worked, mostly, but it also sent a clear message about where you stood in Rome's estimation. The language barrier created additional layers of misery that Roman citizens never had to navigate. Orders were shouted in Latin by centurions who couldn't be bothered to learn your native tongue and didn't much care whether you understood them perfectly. Miscommunication in combat could get you killed, but miscommunication during daily routine could get you flogged. You learned Latin fast, or you learned to enjoy pain, and most auxiliaries discovered they had a remarkable aptitude for foreign languages when the alternative was a vine staff across the skull. Cultural differences became sources of constant friction, and occasional entertainment for bored Romans. Your religious practices were tolerated as long as they didn't interfere with military efficiency, but they were also mocked by soldiers who thought their gods were obviously superior to yours. Your dietary restrictions were ignored completely because the army fed you what it fed everyone else, and if your ancestors would roll over in their graves seeing you eat pork, well, your ancestors weren't carrying 60 pounds of gear across hostile territory. The social dynamics within mixed units created a complex hierarchy based on citizenship, ethnicity, length of service, and personal relationships with Roman officers. Germanic auxiliaries looked down on Celtic recruits. Gallic veterans considered themselves superior to fresh Germanic conscripts. Everyone united in their disdain for auxiliaries from recently conquered territories who hadn't yet learned to properly hate their former countrymen. It was like a twisted version of high school, except everyone had weapons and unresolved trauma. Marriage presented special challenges for auxiliary soldiers because the rules were different for citizens and non-citizens. Roman legionaries weren't supposed to marry during their service, but they often formed unofficial relationships that were tolerated by commanders. Auxiliaries faced additional restrictions because their marriages could complicate questions of citizenship and inheritance. Your children's legal status depended on complex regulations that changed depending on where you were stationed and which emperor was currently in charge. The promise of citizenship after 25 years of faithful service was the carrot that kept auxiliary units motivated, but it was a carrot that many soldiers never lived to taste. Combat casualties were higher among auxiliary units because they were used for the most dangerous missions. Disease claimed auxiliaries at higher rates because they often received medical attention after Roman citizens had been treated. Even administrative errors could delay or prevent citizenship grants, leaving veterans legally stateless after decades of service. Regional specialisation meant that auxiliary units were often stationed far from their homelands to prevent them from developing divided loyalties. Gallic cavalry found themselves fighting in Germania. Germanic infantry was sent to Britain. Syrian archers ended up in Romania. This geographic displacement was strategically sound but personally devastating for soldiers who knew they might never see their birthplaces again. Homesickness became a chronic condition that no amount of military discipline could cure. The relationship between auxiliary units and local populations was complicated by the fact that auxiliaries were often used to police territories inhabited by their own ethnic groups. A Germanic auxiliary might find himself suppressing a rebellion by Germanic tribes who saw him as a traitor to his own people. The psychological stress of fighting against men who shared your language, your customs, and your blood was something Roman military planners acknowledged but never adequately addressed. Training accidents occurred more frequently in auxiliary units, partly because their equipment was less reliable, and partly because Roman instructors were less careful about the safety of non-citizen recruits. A broken sword during weapons drill might mean a cut hand for a Roman legionary who could demand better equipment. For an auxiliary, it might mean a severed artery and a quiet burial outside the camp walls, because replacing foreign recruits was easier than fixing foreign equipment. The auxiliary cavalry units faced unique challenges, because mounted warfare required expensive horses and specialised equipment that the Empire was reluctant to provide to non-citizens. Cavalrymen often had to provide their own mounts, or accept animals that were too old, too young, or too temperamental for reliable military service. A horse that stumbled during a charge wasn't just an embarrassment. It was a death sentence for the rider, and potentially for his entire unit if the formation collapsed. Religious tensions simmered constantly beneath the surface of auxiliary life, because soldiers from different backgrounds brought conflicting beliefs about everything from proper burial practices to dietary restrictions to the role of women in military camps. Roman commanders generally took a pragmatic approach to these differences, allowing diversity as long as it didn't interfere with military effectiveness. But when resources were scarce or discipline broke down, religious conflicts could explode into violence that weakened unit cohesion. The auxiliary soldiers' relationship with Roman law was particularly complex because different legal standards applied to citizens and non-citizens. Punishments for the same crimes could vary dramatically depending on your legal status. A Roman citizen might face demotion for insubordination, while an auxiliary could be executed for the same offence. This created an atmosphere of uncertainty where soldiers never knew exactly what consequences their actions might bring. Language barriers extended beyond simple communication problems to create deeper issues of cultural misunderstanding. Roman concepts of honour, duty, and loyalty didn't always translate directly into other cultural frameworks. What Romans saw as necessary discipline, auxiliaries might interpret as arbitrary cruelty. What auxiliaries viewed as maintaining cultural identity, Romans might regard as dangerous separatism. These misunderstandings could escalate quickly in the high-stress environment of military life. The auxiliary units served as laboratories for Roman military innovation because commanders were more willing to experiment with foreign troops than risk citizen soldiers in untested tactics. New weapons, different formations, unusual strategies were all tried out on auxiliary units first. If they worked, Romans adopted them. If they failed, well, the casualties were mostly non-citizens anyway. This experimental approach led to genuine tactical improvements, but at a human cost that was rarely calculated in official reports. Medical care for auxiliaries was provided by the same military physicians who treated Roman citizens, but the quality and priority of treatment reflected social hierarchies that extended into the field hospitals. Citizen soldiers received attention first, better supplies, and more careful monitoring during recovery. Auxiliaries waited longer, made do with fewer resources, and were expected to return to duty sooner regardless of their condition. The mortality rate from treatable injuries was significantly higher among auxiliary troops. The psychological impact of serving an empire that had conquered your homeland created unique forms of stress that Roman military medicine was completely unprepared to handle. Auxiliary soldiers often suffered from what modern psychologists might recognize as identity confusion, survivor guilt, and cultural displacement disorders. These conditions manifested as depression, anxiety, violent outbursts, or withdrawal from social interaction. Roman treatment consisted of discipline, punishment, or discharge, none of which addressed the underlying psychological trauma. Career advancement for auxiliary soldiers was theoretically possible, but practically limited by informal barriers that kept non-citizens out of senior positions. An auxiliary might rise to become a centurion of auxiliary troops, but he would never command Roman legionaries. This glass ceiling created frustration among competent foreign soldiers who could see their abilities being wasted because of their birth status. Some transferred their ambitions to their children, hoping that citizenship would open doors that remained closed to them. The integration of auxiliary units into the broader Roman military machine required constant balancing of competing interests and loyalties. Too much autonomy and auxiliary commanders might develop independent power bases that threatened imperial authority. Too little autonomy and foreign troops might rebel against what they saw as oppressive micromanagement. Roman administrators walked this tightrope with varying degrees of success, sometimes achieving genuine cooperation, and sometimes barely maintaining control through fear and force. The auxiliary soldiers' retirement was even more uncertain than that of Roman citizens, because their benefits depended on legal status that could be revoked or challenged long after their service ended. Veterans who had earned citizenship might find their documents questioned by suspicious officials who assumed all foreign papers were forgeries. Land grants promised to auxiliary veterans were often located in territories even more remote and dangerous than those given to citizen soldiers. The frontier farms that were supposed to represent security and prosperity often became isolated outposts where former soldiers spent their final years fighting the same enemies they'd battled during their military careers. The children of auxiliary soldiers occupied an ambiguous position in Roman society, neither fully Roman nor entirely foreign. Their father's military service provided some protection and opportunities, but cultural prejudices limited their acceptance in civilian communities. Many gravitated toward military careers themselves, creating dynasties of professional soldiers who served the empire across multiple generations, while never quite belonging to it completely. The legacy of auxiliary service extended far beyond individual soldiers to reshape the ethnic composition of the Roman military, and eventually the empire itself. As citizenship was gradually extended to more auxiliary veterans and their families, the definition of what it meant to be Roman evolved to include people whose ancestors had once fought against Roman expansion. This transformation was slow, often resisted, and never complete, but it fundamentally altered the character of the empire. Some auxiliary units developed reputations that outlasted the soldiers who originally served in them. The Batavian cavalry, Syrian archers, and Gallic infantry became legendary for their specialized skills and fierce loyalty to Rome. These units were often transferred intact from one frontier to another, maintaining their ethnic identity and military traditions across decades of service. Veterans of famous auxiliary units enjoyed higher status than ordinary foreign recruits, but they also faced higher expectations and more dangerous assignments. The auxiliary system created a pathway to Roman citizenship that was theoretically available to anyone willing to serve, but in practice it was a grueling test that eliminated most candidates through death, disability, or desertion. The promise of citizenship motivated countless young men to enlist, but the reality of auxiliary service was so harsh that only a fraction survived to claim their reward. Those who did survive often discovered that citizenship without wealth or connections provided fewer benefits than they had expected. The Roman military's dependence on auxiliary troops revealed fundamental weaknesses in the imperial system that would eventually contribute to its collapse. As the empire expanded beyond its ability to recruit adequate numbers of citizen soldiers, it became increasingly reliant on foreign troops whose loyalty was conditional and whose cultural integration was incomplete. This created vulnerabilities that enemies learned to exploit through propaganda, bribery, and appeals to ethnic solidarity. The auxiliary soldiers' experience embodied the contradictions of Roman imperialism. The empire offered opportunities for advancement and citizenship to conquered peoples, while simultaneously treating them as second-class participants in the system they were asked to defend. This tension between inclusion and exclusion, between opportunity and exploitation, between Roman ideals and Roman practices, defined not just military service but the entire imperial project. In the end, the auxiliary troops who served Rome faithfully for 25 years often found themselves caught between worlds, no longer fully part of the cultures they'd been born into, but never entirely accepted by the civilization they'd chosen to serve. They were Romans by law but foreigners by birth, citizens by service but aliens by blood. Their sacrifice made the empire possible, but their reward was often a citizenship that felt hollow and a retirement that felt like exile. The irony was inescapable. The men who had extended Roman power to the ends of the known world often spent their final years on the margins of Roman society, honoured in theory but ignored in practice, celebrated in official ceremonies but forgotten in daily life. They'd given everything to become Romans, only to discover that being Roman meant something different for people who had to earn it through blood than for those who had inherited it through birth. And perhaps that was the most Roman lesson of all, that the empire's greatest strength, its ability to absorb and utilise foreign populations, was also its greatest weakness. Every auxiliary soldier who earned citizenship through faithful service was proof that Rome could transform enemies into allies. But every auxiliary veteran who died forgotten and impoverished on a frontier farm was also proof that Rome's promises were as fragile as the parchment they were written on. The auxiliary soldier's story was the empire's story in miniature. Brutal, magnificent, contradictory, and ultimately tragic. A system that could turn barbarian warriors into disciplined soldiers, that could offer citizenship to the children of enemies, that could create loyalty out of conquest and hope out of subjugation. But also a system that consumed lives without mercy, that broke promises without shame, and that demanded everything while giving back just enough to keep the machine running. You wouldn't last a day as an auxiliary soldier, not because the physical demands were impossibly harsh, though they were, and not because the training was unbearably brutal, though it was. You wouldn't last because the psychological cost of serving an empire that conquered your people, displaced your culture, and demanded your loyalty while never quite accepting your humanity, would destroy your sense of self more completely than any enemy weapon ever could. The Roman legion wasn't just a military force, it was a transformation machine that took human beings and turned them into instruments of imperial will. For citizen soldiers, this transformation was painful but comprehensible. They were becoming better Romans. For auxiliary troops, the transformation was existential. They were becoming Romans, period, abandoning everything they had been to become something they might never truly be allowed to be. And in that transformation, in that sacrifice of identity for the promise of belonging, lay the true horror of the Roman military system. It didn't just break your body or crush your spirit. It erased your past and replaced it with a future that belonged not to you, but to an empire that would forget your name before your bones stopped aching. The auxiliary soldier's oath wasn't just a promise to serve Rome faithfully. It was a contract to cease existing as anything other than a tool of imperial expansion. And unlike the citizen soldiers who at least retained their Roman identity throughout their service, auxiliary troops had to earn the right to an identity they might never fully possess while surrendering the one they'd been born with. That was the genius and the cruelty of the Roman system. It offered everything to everyone while delivering just enough to keep them fighting for more. The auxiliary soldier's 25 years of service wasn't just military duty. It was a prolonged audition for membership in a club that might never fully accept him, conducted under conditions designed to test not just his loyalty, but his willingness to become someone else entirely. And the most tragic part was that it worked. Auxiliary soldiers did earn citizenship. Foreign cultures were absorbed into the Roman system. Barbarian enemies became imperial defenders. The transformation was real, even if it was incomplete, which meant that every auxiliary soldier faced a choice that was no choice at all: remain yourself and remain an outsider, or become Roman and lose yourself forever. The Roman legion destroyed its soldiers systematically and efficiently, but it destroyed its auxiliary troops twice, once when it conquered their peoples, and again when it offered them a chance to join the conquerors. The citizen soldiers at least knew what they were signing up for. The auxiliaries discovered too late that the price of Roman citizenship was everything that had made them who they were before they ever heard of Rome. In the end, that might have been the empire's most insidious victory. Not just conquering foreign lands, but convincing foreign peoples to conquer themselves in pursuit of Roman approval that would always remain just slightly out of reach. The auxiliary system didn't just provide troops for the legions, it provided proof that Rome's way of life was so superior that people would sacrifice their own identities to obtain it. And every auxiliary soldier who died forgotten on a frontier farm was evidence that even when the system worked exactly as designed, it still left its victims broken, displaced, and ultimately expendable. Rome got its soldiers, the empire got its borders, and the auxiliary troops got citizenship documents that often proved as worthless as the promises that had convinced them to enlist. The machine kept running, fed by fresh recruits who hadn't yet learned that serving Rome meant ceasing to be themselves. And the empire grew stronger with each generation of foreign soldiers who traded their heritage for the privilege of dying in Roman colours, for Roman dreams that would never quite become their own. The machine's final betrayal wasn't the bloodshed or the brutality, it was what happened after you survived. Because here's the thing about the Roman legion that no recruiting officer ever mentioned. It didn't just break your body during service. It programmed you to keep breaking yourself long after the Eagle standards had moved on without you. You see, Rome understood something that modern military psychologists are only beginning to grasp. The most effective way to control a population isn't through laws or walls or even swords held at throats. It's through creating people who genuinely believe their suffering serves a greater purpose. People who will police themselves, punish themselves, and sacrifice themselves without anyone having to ask them to do it. Your 25 years of service weren't just military duty. They were an extended course in self-destruction, disguised as honour. Every time you followed an order that violated your conscience, you learned to ignore your internal voice. Every time you watched injustice and stayed silent, you practiced moral blindness. Every time you participated in brutality and called it necessary, you rewrote your understanding of right and wrong. The genius of the system was that it made resistance feel like betrayal. Not betrayal of Rome, though that too, but betrayal of your fellow soldiers who depended on you. Betrayal of the dead who had sacrificed everything for the same cause. Betrayal of your younger self who had sworn an oath and meant it with every fibre of his being. So you learned to betray yourself instead, day by day, order by order, atrocity by atrocity. Until the person you had been before taking that oath became a stranger whose thoughts and feelings seemed foreign and dangerous. Until questioning the system felt like questioning gravity, or wondering if fire might not actually be hot. The physical training was nothing compared to this psychological conditioning. Your body could be rebuilt after discharge. Muscles could heal, scars could fade, even missing limbs could be adapted to with time and effort. But your mind, your sense of self, your capacity for independent moral judgment, these things once broken stayed broken. Veterans often found civilian life unbearable, not because it was harder than military service, but because it was easier. Too easy. The absence of constant threat and rigid structure created an anxiety that could only be relieved by finding new ways to suffer. Some became alcoholics, numbing the pain of peace with wine that tasted like forgetting. Others sought out dangerous occupations, becoming gladiators or bodyguards or mercenaries, because violence was the only environment where they felt normal. Many simply retreated from human contact entirely. They built isolated farms on dangerous frontiers where the daily threat of barbarian raids provided the stress their nervous systems had been trained to require. They surrounded themselves with weapons and fortifications and spent their days scanning horizons for enemies who might never come, because the alternative was confronting the enemy they'd become to themselves. The saddest cases were the veterans who tried to recreate military hierarchy in civilian settings. They became the brutal overseers of agricultural estates, the sadistic guards in urban prisons, the enforcers for corrupt officials who needed someone comfortable with violence and untroubled by conscience. They found new ways to serve power, because submission to authority was the only relationship they understood anymore. Rome didn't need to maintain armies of occupation in pacified territories, because it had created armies of occupation inside the minds of its former soldiers. Veterans carried imperial values wherever they went, spreading Roman attitudes about hierarchy, obedience, and the proper relationship between rulers and ruled. They became walking advertisements for the imperial system, living proof that Roman methods worked because look how disciplined and effective they had become. But the most insidious aspect of this psychological programming was how it affected the next generation. Veterans raised their children according to military principles because those were the only principles they remembered believing in: harsh discipline, unquestioning obedience, preparation for conflict that might never come. They passed on their trauma disguised as wisdom, their damaged worldview packaged as practical education. Children of veterans grew up in households where love was conditional on compliance, where questioning authority was treated as moral failure, where strength was measured by the ability to endure suffering without complaint. They learned to see the world as Romans saw it, divided into those who commanded and those who obeyed, those who conquered and those who were conquered, those who mattered and those who were expendable. And many of these children, raised on stories of military glory and infected with their father's unhealed wounds, chose to enlist themselves. Not because they were forced to, but because military service seemed like the most meaningful path available to them, because they had been raised by men who could only find purpose in service to something larger than themselves, even when that something cared nothing for their individual welfare. The cycle perpetuated itself across generations. Rome didn't need to conscript soldiers because it had created a culture that produced them voluntarily. Veterans who had been broken by the system became its most effective recruiters, not through lies or promises, but through their own damaged example. Young men looked at scarred, bitter, haunted former legionaries and thought, I want to be like that. I want to matter that much. The Empire's true genius wasn't in its engineering or its laws or its military tactics. It was in creating people who would maintain imperial values long after imperial power had collapsed. Romans built roads and aqueducts that lasted centuries, but they built mindsets that lasted millennia. The psychological infrastructure of empire proved more durable than any physical construction. Even when barbarian armies finally overwhelmed Roman defences and the last emperors fled into exile, the Roman way of thinking persisted. Former provinces continued to organise themselves along imperial lines. New kingdoms adopted Roman legal principles. Conquered peoples preserved Roman customs and traditions because those ways of life felt natural and necessary to populations that had been shaped by centuries of imperial conditioning. The veterans who survived to see the empire's collapse often couldn't comprehend what had happened. How could something so powerful, so permanent, so obviously superior to all alternatives simply disappear? They had invested their entire identities in serving a system that claimed to be eternal. When that system proved mortal after all, many veterans felt not relief but existential terror. If Rome could fall, then everything they had suffered for was meaningless. Some spent their final years trying to recreate Roman order in miniature, establishing small communities governed by military discipline and imperial values. They trained local militias according to legion standards, built fortifications according to Roman engineering principles, and enforced Roman laws even when no Roman authority remained to back them up. They became emperors of villages, generals of farms, centurions of their own fading memories. Others embraced the collapse as liberation they hadn't known they needed. These were the veterans who had somehow maintained enough of their original selves to remember what life had been like before the legion consumed them. They threw away their military gear, abandoned their veteran status, and tried to become civilians for the first time in decades. Most failed because the skills required for independent life had been systematically destroyed during their service, but a few succeeded in finding peace they had forgotten was possible. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman authority faced a peculiar challenge: what to do with thousands of former legionaries who remained dangerous even in retirement. Some new rulers incorporated veterans into their own military systems, essentially hiring the empire's former enforcers to maintain order under different banners. Others tried to isolate veteran communities, treating them as potentially seditious populations that needed careful monitoring. But the deepest damage couldn't be addressed through political solutions because it wasn't political in nature. It was psychological, spiritual, existential. The Roman legion hadn't just recruited soldiers, it had manufactured a specific type of human being, efficient, obedient, emotionally numbed, and incapable of questioning the systems they served. These men couldn't simply choose to become something else when their empire disappeared. They had been too thoroughly transformed. The archaeological record tells part of this story. Veteran settlements across the former empire show evidence of defensive construction that continued long after any military threat had passed. Former soldiers kept building walls, digging ditches, and stockpiling weapons because they couldn't conceive of safety without fortification. They had been trained to see enemies everywhere, and that training outlasted the empire that had provided it. Personal artifacts found in veteran graves reveal the psychological persistence of military identity. Soldiers buried with their weapons decades after discharge. Centurions' vine staffs placed in tombs beside men who had been farmers for 20 years. Military decorations worn by civilians who had no army left to serve. These weren't just mementos, they were identity anchors for men who had forgotten how to be anything other than soldiers. The linguistic evidence is equally telling. Latin military terminology persisted in local languages long after Latin itself had evolved into regional dialects. Words for discipline, hierarchy, and obedience maintained their Roman forms while other vocabulary changed beyond recognition. The concepts the legion had embedded in human consciousness proved more durable than the empire that had created them. Religious practices also preserved military influences. Christian monasteries in former Roman territories adopted organizational structures that closely resembled legion hierarchies. Monks followed daily routines that mirrored military discipline. Monastic. Rules emphasized obedience, sacrifice, and submission to authority in ways that would have been familiar to any centurion. The church became a new kind of legion, conquering souls instead of territories, but using remarkably similar methods. The economic systems that emerged from imperial collapse often reflected military organizational principles as well. Agricultural estates operated like permanent camps with strict hierarchies and rigid schedules. Trade guilds adopted rank structures and initiation rituals that echoed military traditions. Even civilian governments organized themselves according to patterns that former legionaries found comfortable and natural. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Roman military conditioning was its influence on concepts of masculinity and honour. The ideal man, according to post-imperial European culture, was disciplined, stoic, willing to sacrifice personal happiness for duty, and comfortable with violence when necessary. These weren't universal human values. They were specifically Roman military values that had been so thoroughly internalized by conquered populations that they seemed like natural law. Centuries after the last legion had marched into history, European societies continued to organize themselves around principles that would have been immediately recognizable to any Roman officer. Feudal hierarchies, military orders, concepts of knightly virtue, all bore the genetic fingerprints of imperial conditioning. The legion had disappeared, but its psychological DNA persisted in the cultural bloodstream. Modern military organizations still employ techniques that Roman commanders would recognize instantly. Basic training designed to break down civilian identity and rebuild it along military lines. Unit cohesion created through shared hardship and mutual dependence. Leadership through fear balanced with just enough reward to maintain hope. The specific methods have evolved, but the underlying psychology remains remarkably consistent. The Roman legion's true achievement wasn't conquering territory or building infrastructure or even lasting for centuries as a military institution. Its achievement was creating a template for human organization that proved so effective, so adaptable, and so psychologically compelling that variations of it continue to shape human societies today. Every modern military that emphasizes discipline over initiative, every corporation that demands loyalty over creativity, every educational system that values conformity over critical thinking carries forward some aspect of Roman military conditioning. The specific empire may have fallen, but the imperial mindset it created lives on in countless institutional forms. The veterans who limped away from Rome's collapse were not just witnesses to the end of an empire. They were carriers of its essential spirit, walking repositories of organizational knowledge that would influence human development for millennia to come. There, broken bodies healed eventually. Their programmed minds never did. And through them, through their children, through the institutions they created and the values they preserved, The Roman legion achieved a kind of immortality that no emperor ever dreamed of. You wouldn't last a day in the Roman legion, not because you lack the physical strength or mental toughness to endure its brutality. You wouldn't last because the person who could survive that system would no longer be you in any meaningful sense. The legion didn't just recruit soldiers, it manufactured them, transforming human raw material into something that served imperial purposes perfectly, while sacrificing everything that made life worth living. The price of belonging to the greatest military machine in human history was becoming a machine yourself. And once that transformation was complete, once your individual will had been replaced by institutional programming, there was no going back. The empire might fall, the eagles might be lost, the borders might collapse, but the legion would live on forever in the minds it had conquered more completely than any territory it had ever claimed. That was Rome's final victory and its ultimate tragedy. It created soldiers so perfect, so thoroughly conditioned, so completely loyal, that they continued serving an empire that no longer existed, following orders from commanders who were centuries dead, marching toward objectives that had lost all meaning except as expressions of their own psychological captivity. The Roman legion didn't just end when the last eagle was retired, it ended when the last veteran finally learned to live without it, and for many that day never came at all.